Thank you for joining the session today. Today's day 2 of FireEye CDS. I think you've picked the right session to go to today. Today is it's going to be a phenomenal day. The executive track is outstanding, and quite frankly, this is one of the talks that I'm the most excited to see, because both Matthew and Manfred have lived through hundreds of breaches and helped a number of organizations respond, contain incidents, eradicate threat actors, and they've kind of come up with a playbook of what are the things that they commonly see from a breach response perspective that organizations tend to focus on after the incident. And so they're going to share their perspectives and their guides on what they call proactive remediation, so that non-victim organizations can really take the learnings from all the breaches that we've investigated to become more resilient to attacks. So please join me in welcoming Matthew and Manfred.
Thanks, everybody. So as Charles mentioned, and if you saw Frank Blake's keynote this morning, it was a lot of reflection after an incident and what did they learn and what could they have done better. We want to kind of flip the tables a little bit and talk about all of the things that organizations can do better based upon the learnings, as Charles mentioned, that we've experienced in helping organizations when they're going through either a short-term containment or a longer-term full remediation type of activity. As you'll see as we go through these slides, there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of preparation, there's a lot of pre-gaming that happens. Remediation just doesn't automatically happen over a 48-hour period. So we want to kind of educate organizations about what you can start doing today. There's no hard, fast, steady rule that says you have to wait till you've had an incident within your environment to start taking these actions. These are all things that you can start doing proactively, and that's the theme that we want to address and that we're going to go through in our content. So we have a lot of slides, so we're just going to get going here. We're going to start off with a case study. So we're going to talk about a real-world incident that it's very representative of incidents that Manfred and I support. We're going to kind of talk through what the attacker did and what the remediation for that looked like. Then we're going to give a high-level overview of what is remediation. When you hear that word, what are the core stages that we at Mandiant utilize to assist companies going through a remediation event? And then we're going to focus on that proactive pre-mediation. What can you start doing today to better further enhance the security of your environment? So my name is Matthew McCourt. I'm a senior manager within the Security Transformation Services team at FireEye Mandiant. I've been with the company about 3 years, started really doing incident response investigations, and really over the past 2 years have focused a lot on remediation, trying to formalize how do we do remediation when we work with clients. So remediation is kind of one area that I just really love. I really love working in Active Directory, so we're going to kind of do a little deep dive into Active Directory a little bit later on in this presentation. But that's kind of my focus within the team, is really helping companies going through a remediation type of event. Manfred?
Yeah, my name is Manfred Dörczak. I'm principal consultant at Mandiant. I'm with Mandiant almost 4 years, located in Austria, part of the international team of Security Transformation Service, and work together with Matthew to help customers to remediate breaches. Yeah, when we talk about breaches, when we work as an incident responder on a day-to-day basis, we always see that breaches are inevitable. So this is a fact. And organizations have to accept this fact, and they have to live with that situation. So that's the way the cookie crumbles. But on the other side, what we also can tell a customer is, and what we see is that impactful breaches are preventable. And with our approach of pre-remediation, we can help the customer to get to the stage that they prevent their environment, their processes, that the breach will not be impactful. So let's talk about the case study Matthew mentioned. So what happened there? This was an organization, very mature, very good detection mechanisms. And what happened? Initially, the attacker started with spear phishing to the end users, and the end users used their VDI environment to read the emails. Based on that, it happened that credentials got compromised because there was domain admin credentials stored in memory on the VDI environment, which allows then the attacker to take out those credentials and to place a backdoor within the VDI environment. So they used this, made this persistent. They jumped within the VDI cluster from system to systems, did then internal reconnaissance, used a couple of tools like AD Explorer or did SMB scanning, which allows them to then further dump credential dumping of other domain admin users, which in the end allows them to reach out to an HR system in the DM set to place there a web shell. So this web shell was like as a backup. So when the backdoors on the VDI environment got identified, the attacker still have access to the environment. And what we also recognized in this engagement was that the attacker was really focusing on members of this company were named in the news, which has an interesting profile on LinkedIn. So this was very targeted on that. Good thing was that we were able to identify the attack in a short time period, so within 72 hours. Together with the customer, we come up with a quick eradication plan, talk with them what can be done. Customer did a very good job to eradicate the environment, but we also had some restrictions. So what was done? We blocked the NBIs, we removed the backdoors on the VDI environment, we removed the web shells. Some of the VDI servers needs to be rebuilt from scratch. Customer then started to implement multi-factor authentication for the external internet-facing VDI and out-of web access. And the limitation we had there was that the customer decided then to do a targeted password reset. So only reset a couple of passwords which was compromised by the attacker, because there was not time enough to prepare a full comprehensive enterprise password reset. And as additional countermeasures, customer came in up to implement labs in this case.
All right, so the major plot twist that nobody saw coming. About 2 months later, after the eradication event, the attacker comes back. So as Manfred mentioned, this was a very mature company that had really awesome detection capabilities. So within about 3 hours of an attacker executing credential dumping on a VDI platform, they received an alert. And that was their initial trigger to investigate further. So they actually contacted Mandiant to really help reinvestigate, to determine, well, we did everything, we kicked them out, is this the same attacker, and how did this happen? So luckily, we had our technology was actually already in place. So we were able to pretty quickly, within 72 hours, kind of work our way backwards and kind of fully scope out what happened as part of, how did the attacker get back in to dump credentials on that same VDI platform? So it turns out, if you remember, this client implemented multi-factor authentication during that initial eradication event. Unfortunately, there was actually a way to get around it. So if you knew the public IP address of one of the client access servers for Exchange, one of the CAS servers, you could hit that directly via the IP address, and you've circumvented the multi-factor authentication portal. So if you have somebody's valid username and password, you could actually log in and have Outlook web access type access within the environment. It was also kind of interesting for that VDI that was targeted, even though it now has multi-factor authentication, the one-time passcodes were being sent to email addresses of users. So once this attacker logged into OWA, they set up a rule to they created a folder and moved any messages relevant to VDI one-time passwords to a certain folder so the user wouldn't be tipped off. They log into Citrix or Temp2 with the valid creds, and they access the email to get the one-time password, and bam, they're back on the VDI, escalate privileges, and once again, they're able to extract privileged account password hashes in memory. So we found that all that out working kind of backwards through the investigation that they contacted us to assist with. So a couple lessons learned here. If you remember, they didn't do a full enterprise-wide password reset. Right? They did just targeted accounts that they saw the attacker use the first time. So they still had valid creds for users, because most organizations, change passwords every 60 to 90 days. This was like 2 months later. So a lot of the password hashes and dumps that they got the first time were still valid. So that's what they likely used to get back in and find this external-facing CAS server. So now, the client does not want to go through this a third time, right? And I don't think, obviously, they didn't want to go through it a second time. So now full remediation actions are on the table, right? So this was a deep dive enterprise-wide password reset. This is resetting the password for every single account and the environment. And a little bit later in the presentation, we're going to talk about what did that look like? What did they have to do to lead up to actually executing that? Because there's a lot of detailed steps required in order to pull that off. They really wanted to ensure that they had optimized visibility. Even though they had awesome detection on that VDI platform, there were still some blind spots in their network and on some endpoints they didn't really feel comfortable with their level of visibility and detection if the attacker came back using a different tactic. So once again, we spent some time ensuring that they had optimized visibility and really just awareness of their environment for this full remediation event. The network architecture review. As Manfred mentioned, when they landed on the VDI, they got privileged access, and they used SMB and RDP to kind of move around the environment. So the client enforced some internal network segmentation to really restrict the scope of protocols that could be used. So if somebody does land on a VDI, where can they get to? Can they even attempt to RDP to a domain controller or to an Exchange server, or even to somebody's desktop or laptop? So they really did some internal segmentation and internal network hardening. Privileged account management, they kind of took a step back and realized some of the gaps they had from when they tried to implement this very quickly. So they invested in a PAM solution to kind of manage a lot of their privileged accounts, but they also did a lot in group policy to reduce the scope of privileged accounts on common endpoints, and we'll talk through that a little bit later in the presentation. They reviewed their implementation of how did they initially implement MFA, what were some of the gaps there, because they just had to get it in place very quickly. And they did a full local admin password elapse implementation for all systems within the environment. This probably took about a month for them to execute all of these activities in these 2 slides. But it was ultimately, this is what was necessary to not have a rinse and repeat a third time of an attacker coming back just because of the quick eradication that was done initially.
Yeah, as we know, each breach is different, each customer environment is different. But however, when we work with remediation on the case with the customers, in most cases, I would say more than half of the recommendation we can provide are the same. And then we come up with the idea of proactively remediation. We call it pre-remediation, which should allow the customer to implement the common remediation steps within their environment before a breach is happening to reduce the impact of a breach. So when we talk about remediation, we talk about 4 main steps. Number 1 is posturing. It's all about to increase the security posture, to increase the visibility and the detection mechanisms, what are available. Also to make the environment more investigator-friendly in this case. It's all about then when we talk asset management, but then we sit together with the customer and say, hey, do you know where are your crown jewels? What are your main critical server systems? Can we increase the visibility in this area to see if the attacker already reached out to them or will move forward to them? And we also start in a posturing phase with the planning of the subsequent phases, like containment, eradication, and strategic enhancement, because this needs time. The next phase is the containment phase. And containment is tactical. It's a short-term mitigation action. It's more or less about stop the bleeding, stop the attacker moving forward, but it will not eradicate the attacker from your environment. So this is what you have to set out when the attacker is reaching out to a PCI or PAI environment, which is critical, or critical production environment. So then you have to set containment actions. And those need to be prepared because this can have a negative impact on your business. So you have to isolate critical systems in this case. And when I say isolate critical systems, you have to know the critical systems beforehand, where they are. The third stage is the stage where you need to prepare it most. It's the eradication. And typically, we start with the eradication when we talk about the full-scoped breach, when we know really the TTP of the attack. We have a good overview, how is the attacker moving forward, what's the tactics, what tools they are using so far. So we're sweeping the environment, identifying the systems. We are not able to generate new IOCs. We say, OK, now we have a good scope. Now it's time to eradicate and get rid of the attacker in the environment. And typical eradication is then, we do it on a weekend. So it's all about then block C2 communication, rebuild systems which got compromised, do a full enterprise password reset, implement network segmentation, application whitelisting, and so on. And so, as you know, this takes time to prepare. And when you are under pressure during a breach, you do not have the time all the day to do that. Yeah, and the last one, these are the strategic enhancements out of that breach. So this is more or less the lessons learned, and also which gives you an opportunity, mid and long term, to increase the security posture, to increase technically or process-wise, that next time you are quicker to identify misbehavior within your environment. So when we talk then about pre-remediation, we recommend then some general post-sharing activities. And this will give you then time to be honest with your environment, to have a look on them, to identify gaps. And this gives you then time to fill up these gaps, make a proper planning, also then to get budgeting in some cases. So there we say, okay, number one is visibility and detection. Mainly on the endpoints. So how are your visibility capabilities? It's also about, are you able to identify non-compliant systems within your environment? It's also about your network capabilities, detection capabilities. Third thing is also, are you aware where are your crown jewels? Not where you think are they. So that you have a time to identify those gaps. Then very important, asset management. That you can say, okay, I have a proper asset management. I know my stuff. I know my ingress and my egress points. So for example, when customers are calling us and say, hey, we need support there, we see maybe we are breached and we parachute into them, we start to roll out our endpoint solution that we can do the investigation. And in addition, we have to place our network sensors. In most cases, we come up with a discussion with the customers. They say, oh, how many endpoints do you have? And where are they located? Oh, by the way, we have somewhere overseas. Nobody knows exactly what's going on there. We have no visibility. So with pre-remediation, you should have the time, go through it, scan your environment, have different views on it. And yeah, sometimes you will not feel comfortable with that, but this is a good exercise. And also the thing is about vulnerability management. Do you have a vulnerability management in place? How is the process? How quick you can fix vulnerabilities? Also, in some environments, you will not be able to always patch systems. For example, you have a production environment. Then you have to isolate the system because it's not always possible to implement all the patches that are required. And one thing we spend most time in the post-sharing is about event logging. How does your event logging look like? Are you logging the events of your domain controllers and your servers? In an ideal environment, also the event logs of the end user systems. But this then depends the sizing of the Splunk solution, for example, what you have in place, or how you want to transport the event logs. Or you have legal restrictions. I'm from Europe, so in Europe it's not allowed to measure the employees' performance based on some event logs. So you have a huge discussion with Workers' Council. They say, oh, when you log all events they do on the endpoints, you can measure his performance. We block that. So in such case would be good, then increase the local logging of the event logs on the end systems, so that you then, in a case of an investigation, can use your EDR environment and you still have the logs available on the endpoint. As well as what we see, PowerShell logging. Also important, DNS, network logs. When we talk about proxy servers, you must have enabled XFF, so X forwarded F header in the logs, that you're able to identify which client did the requests, that they have the visibility to say, okay, can I filter on specific user agents within my environment? So all these are the main steps, and this you can prepare upfront. Another point which also is important is network segmentation. So you should have a proper network segmentation in place. And I know from my past as a network engineer, especially network engineers do not like that, because this one has an impact, can have an impact on the performance. It can have an impact on the reliability of your systems. And always is the discussion, where are the critical systems, where are the crown jewels? Do we know what IP addresses, what ports the certain application or service need? But it's highly recommended from us, go on with proper network segmentation, identify the critical system, think about, is it necessary that each server is able to reach out to the internet, or is it necessary that you have workstation to workstation communication? So classical tools for, classical thing for network segmentation is, it's starting with VLANs, layer 3 access lists, firewalling, and as I said, it's not like just to place a firewall. If you have a high-performant, high-redundant data center network environment, 40 gig, 100 gig, you cannot just put in a firewall like a stick on it, you know? You need, as I said, preparation, and you need a budget for that. Then what's coming more and more is microsegmentation for your virtualized environment. You have to check what fits in your environment. And as you can imagine, if we are doing this all with time pressure during a breach, it's nearly impossible for the customers to do that. Next. So, yeah, main reason for network segmentation is to protect your critical systems, to reduce the exposure of vulnerable systems. As I mentioned, sometimes it's not always possible to patch all the systems. And main thing, prevent lateral movement in the environment, because this is always happening. So this will slow down the attack. This will frustrate the attacker. On the other side, if we are then forwarding those event log in a SIEM solution, this gives you an early indication, oh, something is moving on, somebody want to move laterally within my environment. On the other side, besides of targeted attacks, this is also a good countermeasure against automated malware distribution, like this WannaCry. Okay, it will not prevent the WannaCry itself, but it will prevent the spread of this ransomware in your environment. So then you have maybe one sector in the network affected, but not, you haven't burned down the whole environment.
All right, the goal of Premediation, and we'll make this evident in a slide towards the end, is protecting the endpoint. It's very evident that the endpoint is sometimes the first and last line of defense, right? If a user gets compromised because they click a link, or maybe a phish gets through all of the email filtering software and firewalls and detection capabilities that are at the perimeter, you want your tools, you want comfort in knowing that your tools on your endpoint are working as intended and hopefully protecting you from attacks. We spend a lot of time in Premediation, unfortunately, doing non-fun things, such as verifying that AV is really working on an endpoint, verifying that the EDR solution is actually running or updated on an endpoint. If you think about it, a lot of clients will leverage their endpoint technologies to help remediate. So they might use it to maybe help block known malware families, or maybe to even remove various types of binaries or files that we uncover through the investigation. Well, if your tools are not running, they're not optimized, the service is not even running, for example, in the endpoints, how effective is that remediation event going to be? So really getting a handle today on, first of all, the scope of endpoint protection tools that you think you have in place, and are they working as intended? And is your investment in your security platform on your endpoint giving you the best return, right? Because we see a lot of companies that have awesome tools, but on certain endpoints, the service has stopped, or it hasn't updated in X number of months. And that takes time to get that fixed in order to leverage that for that remediation event. So that's certainly very important. Even legacy OS technologies, right? I mean, it's great to think everyone's going to be running Windows 10 and Server 2016. That's not the reality. We still see a lot of clients that have XP. We see Windows 2000. We see Windows NT. We see a bunch of everything, right? Obviously, these legacy endpoints can't really be patched. And a lot of times, they're still resident in an environment because there is some sort of older technology that just has to be there for the business to function. So just understanding where those OS technologies exist today, and what sort of barriers, what sort of enclaves, what sort of additional protections can you put in place today so that in the event that you do have some sort of incident or event within your environment and you really want to segment those and kind of isolate those, because maybe you can't even rebuild those systems. That's something that you can start pre-gaming and planning for today. System-to-system communication, Manfred already talked about this. This is especially important when you think about laptops. Right, we might have all these cool VLAN, SVI, ACLs. We've got awesome segmentation on-prem. As soon as somebody takes that laptop, puts it in their bag, and goes home, goes to a hotel, goes to Starbucks, they just plug it in directly to the internet. How are they protected if they're no longer VPN'd in or connected to your network where you have that optimized visibility? So this is really the importance of using group policy to enforce firewall controls for different types of profiles. So there's different ways you can set it up. If you're on the domain, if you're not on the domain, if you're on a public network, you can actually kind of get very verbose on how you define those VLAN, or I'm sorry, those firewall rules on the endpoint. It's very important because we see a lot of compromises that happen off-prem, then somebody reconnects to the network, and that could be patient zero. Microsoft Office hardening controls. There's some great group policies now where you can get very granular on how you can actually restrict and control the execution of certain types of files on an endpoint. So if you think about spear phishing, right? We've heard it from all the keynotes. We heard it from Kevin, and we heard it. It's the continuous theme is spear phishing is the #1 way into an organization. That definitely holds true. Not every email is going to be caught by perimeter protection. So if somebody does open an attachment that maybe it's FIN8 or FIN7 is a perfect example of somebody that likes to be very clever, and they like to use obfuscation to get around common detection methodologies. How can we harden that endpoint using group policy to disable macros? Maybe not for all documents, but at least those from untrusted locations, such as the internet. We could also disable certain functions of OLE for Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Publisher. Dynamic data execution. This is a tactic. If you were in the FIN7 talk yesterday with Regina and Katie, that's a specific tactic that financially motivated attackers leverage. There's a way you can actually control that using group policy to really get a grasp on how you can further lock down endpoints within your environment. Egress restrictions. Manfred hit on this. Do you know if your domain controllers can communicate out to the internet? Can they hit any sites? What about critical servers? What about maybe core information systems within your environment? Do they all need full egress access out to the internet? There's a way that you can start pre-gaming that today, trying to identify ways that you can further restrict and lock down. While this sounds simple, it sounds like a basic concept. If you have to do this during a remediation event, it can be painful because you don't know what might break, right? So maybe you have to put in an ACL and just log it and try to decipher what in the world does this thing really need from a communications perspective. These are all things you can start doing today. You don't have to wait until you're under the gun and under pressure to implement. Microsoft released a patch in 2014, a security update actually. It's 287-1997. It's an amazing update. Hopefully every system within your environment has this. I would assume it does. It introduces a lot of functionality. And we'll kind of reference that as we go through the slides. The really cool one I like is where it references that SID up there. So that's anybody that's a local account and a member of the administrators group. Guess what? You can reference this setting in all of your group policies to block local admins from logging into other endpoints using that local admin account or other accounts that are local to that system that were added to the admin group. You can also, there's also SID 15113, which is all local accounts, whether they're local admin or not. But this is a common one we use to mitigate lateral movement within an environment. Local admin passwords. I'm sure a lot of end users are local admins on their endpoints. There's good reasons, there's bad reasons for that. But there's ways you can actually control that by yourself some time. So maybe you have a roadmap to remove all local admin in the next 12 to 24 months. All right? It's going to take some time to do that. There's some group policy settings you can do now to kind of restrict, even though they have local admin, what could they use or how could they impact other systems or access other systems in their environment today, even with that sort of elevated permission. Randomizing local admin passwords. We heard about LAPS earlier that the client had to do for their eradication and longer-term remediation. LAPS is a free tool from Microsoft that allows you to randomize the password on all endpoints that are part of the Active Directory domain. When you install LAPS, it just extends the Active Directory schema. It adds a simple attribute where that password is stored in Active Directory. I will caution with LAPS. We see a lot of companies roll it out. It's free. You can get it up and going probably in 24 hours. The challenge is you have to delegate access to the scope of accounts that can read that attribute that stores the passwords. So if you have LAPS in your environment, go back and see if you can identify the scope of accounts that can actually read that hidden password attribute. Because sometimes when we do Active Directory security assessments at Mandiant or we're working with clients during remediation, we've seen domain users or authenticated users were granted that privilege. So it's kind of defeats the purpose of LAPS because if anybody can read that attribute, they could still use that local admin account. So this is the general house cleaning that you need to kind of do on a repeatable basis. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just maybe a quick comment or quick question for you. In your experience and maybe in the group's experience here, to what extent in your environment do you find that you have a standard local admin password across fleets of workstations or fleets of servers within the environment? And I know it may be, I'm going to ask the question in a way so that you don't implicate yourself by raising your hand. So just a quick show of hands of who's randomizing local admin passwords today within their environment. So it's actually very few organizations do that. And Matthew, I'm curious, what's your perspective or what's your observation? Do you see?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty normal. A lot of companies don't know about LAPS, unfortunately. There's other tools that do this too, CyberArk, Thycotic, they can all do the same thing. But unfortunately, a lot of companies, either maybe they've heard about it, but they're afraid of the complexities. But this is a quick win, if you will, on how to overcome that challenge that Charles just brought up. I would just like to caution, though, when you roll it out, just be very careful of how you delegate permissions, because we have seen that kind of grow out of control for some organizations that have tried to do it. All right, focusing on Active Directory. So this is like your lawn, right? You planted some grass seed, you aerate, you do all that fun stuff. You have to mow your grass every so often. How many of us go into Active Directory and give it TLC and check up on it and see how things are going? Not just from a performance perspective, but who has access? How many admins do I have? How many service accounts? How many SPNs do I have? This is an area that we spend a lot of times with clients. And remediation is in their Active Directory environment leading up. If they want to do that enterprise-wide password reset and they don't understand their AD environment, that's not going to go well. They'll probably back out of it because a lot of things will break. So we spend a lot of time in Active Directory just trying to understand the environment and help to harden it, not only for remediation, but for the longer-term well-being of that organization. So trusts, Active Directory trusts. We always ask clients, what's the scope of trusts you have? Maybe they'll say, we have a few trusts. They're one-way inbound, one-way outbound. The reality is a lot of time they're just two-way transitive trusts. So what that means is if you're domain A and you have a two-way transitive trust with domain B, and domain B trusts domain C through Z, now domain A trusts all those same domains, right? There's ways to kind of pull back the scope of access on a trust without fully breaking it. It's nice to say you need to destroy that trust, you need to make it one way. That sounds good, but the reality is it could break things. So Microsoft has a great mechanism called selective authentication that you can use for trusts, where you can get very granular and start pulling back the scope of accounts that could actually traverse that trust link into your managed environment. We see challenges with this from a compromise perspective, right? If a trusting entity has an incident, they have an event within their environment with a two-way transitive trust, you automatically, you can pretty much guarantee if they get keys to the kingdom, domain admin, that that's going to be applicable to other environments that are part of that trust. Read-only versus writable domain controllers. Read-only domain controllers are a good thing, right? A lot of companies put them into a DMZ. They'll put them into maybe a site, maybe where they're not sure of the security posture of that site. There's two settings when you set up a read-only domain controller. There's two groups, actually. One is the allowed RODC password replication group, and the second is the deny RODC password replication group. The good thing is Microsoft has been great. They automatically add privileged accounts to that deny RODC replication group. What does that mean? It means that passwords cannot be cached on the read-only domain controller. We have seen a lot of clients, though, that go in and add authenticated users, domain users, even domain admins to the allowed group. And what that means is now those passwords are cached on that read-only domain controller. So now we've just made a read-only domain controller a read-everything domain controller. So when you set those up, monitor access into those groups. There's 4 attributes that are extended when you add a RODC to an Active Directory domain. You can query those using PowerShell. You can look at the groups to really determine the scope of how many passwords are actually cached in our read-only domain controllers that if an attacker got access, they could actually have access to those hashes. GPOs. We spend a lot of time looking at group policies. Group policies are very complicated. They're very complex. Sometimes we still see passwords stored in group policy via group policy preferences. It's kind of the red-headed stepchild of Active Directory. So if you don't know the history there, if you store a password in a group policy, it's encrypted with an AES key. Microsoft published the private key on MSDN a couple years ago. I'm not exactly sure why. But if anybody can obviously extract a group policy via the sysvol folder, it's an XML file. You have a password stored in there, even though it's AES encrypted, I can get the key from MSDN and get the clear text value of that password. So definitely recommend not doing that. There is a patch now that will prevent you from actually storing if you try to do it going forward. But if you've had passwords in group policy preferences prior to the patch, and those passwords haven't changed, they're still there, and they could be used by an attacker. We also see group policy as a challenge where organizations implement a lot of settings via group policy to harden the endpoint. Sometimes those settings are overruled by a higher ranking policy via the order of preference that they're applied from local site, domain, OU, that order of inheritance. Sometimes we've seen group policies with amazing settings that aren't even linked to an OU anymore. They're just sitting there. So really taking a step back and looking at your group policies to determine, are they working as effective as we think? You can run an RSOP, resultant set of policy. you can do a GP result, get the results, take a sampling of your endpoints and run those 2 commands to ensure that the policies that you've set at the domain level are actually enforced and working on the endpoints as anticipated. Yes, sir.
Hello.
Yep.
In your experiences, how often are you seeing organizations in regards to something like an enterprise-wide password reset or turning off the internet have a particular individual or group of individuals that are authorized to make a critical decision like that in addition to owning that accountability and being accountable for making a decision like that?
Oh, you're talking about the decision to actually disconnect or go dark?
Yes.
Yeah, that's generally going to come at the higher level. So generally, that's usually a CIO, CEO type write-off needed for that when that does happen.
Okay. Are you seeing organizations where that's clearly laid out, that there's not a time delay in someone being able to make that call?
Yeah, I mean, we have seen, unfortunately, some clients that can't go dark, because if they do, that's bad for their business. So sometimes we have to kind of do a little bit of containment to buy them some time and then do that eradication without going dark. We had one client that actually went dark for 2 months because it took them that long to get things done. And yeah, and their CEO, or actually their CIO, would not allow them to reconnect until there was assurance that everything had been mitigated. So that was one end of the spectrum. We kind of see a little bit in between. But.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Very quickly, because I know, well, we're going to run out of time. So privileged accounts, password policies. A lot of organizations have one policy, password policy, to rule them all. With Server 2012 and above, you can actually do fine-grained password policies. So you can have a certain set of policies enforced for users, a certain set of policies enforced for service accounts versus privileged accounts. You can get very granular on how you define that. It used to be in Server 2008, you had to use ADSI edit to do it. It was very kludgy, it was very messy, it was hard to figure out. They've made it very easy. It's all UI based now, but you can have various password policies based upon the scope of accounts within your organization. SPNs, I'm going to kind of jump around here so we make sure we cover this. Service principal names, these are very powerful. So these basically represent a unique identifier of a service account to an application. Kerberos uses SPNs in the background to authenticate in the background. So if you think about SQL, other services register as an SPN. Attackers use SPN for Kerberosing and other methods because they're able to get part of the hash and create tickets and do other bad things. By default, all computer accounts register as an SPN, but all user accounts do not. So take a look at the OUs that store user accounts, list out your SPNs. Microsoft has great guidance on how to do that using PowerShell, other methods, and determine what scope of accounts actually are designated as service principal names within your environment, because attackers target those right away. That's what they go for. And oftentimes, those service accounts are highly privileged, so they could even have domain admin or enterprise admin level access. So it's something that obviously you want awareness and visibility of. Delegated accounts, there's 3 types of delegation in ADE. There's Kerberos constrained, Kerberos unconstrained, and full unconstrained, which is called protocol transition. Look at the accounts that have the setting of accounts are able to be delegated. There is a setting where you can turn that off. Definitely recommend that for privileged accounts, but delegated accounts are a way to escalate privileges that attackers will find within your environment by querying Active Directory. wdigest is a legacy, well, somewhat legacy feature inherent to like Windows 7 and below that stores passwords in clear text in memory. So you could have a 128-character password, and if someone's able to extract the memory from that system, they'll get the clear text value if wdigest is enabled. Windows 8, Windows 10 and above, it's disabled now. For Windows 7, there's a registry key, and that KB, that same one I alluded to earlier, you can use to disable wdigest authentication. Microsoft actually just released group policy templates, where you can do this now via group policy, which is really cool. This token leak detect delay sec is a registry key you can make on Windows 7 or Windows 8.1 and below endpoints to determine how long will credentials remain in memory on an endpoint. You can set it for 30 seconds. After that, they're gone from memory. Now, granted, there could still be some tokens. There's other ways. It's not like the be-all, end-all, but it's a great setting to set on legacy endpoints. Windows 10, with the latest update, now enforces this, I think, for 30 seconds by default. Credential guard, LSA protected process are ways to help protect credentials that are in memory on an endpoint. So once somebody logs in, LSA protected process requires a signed binary to be used to interact with the LSA process where credentials are stored in memory. Credential guard basically takes the LSA process and splits it in half. There's two processes running on Credential Guard for Windows 10 and above. One is the regular process for login. One is what's called virtual secure mode, which is the protected process where credentials are stored in memory that Mimikatz and other tools can't use. Word of caution there. That's all relevant after you log in. So if somebody has compromised the system, they have debug level permissions, they can run Mimikatz. Guess what? They can still intercept your creds at login using Mimikatz before the creds go from regular LSA to the VSM mode. So just be aware of that. It's not 100% foolproof. Either is LSA protected process. Mimikatz now has a driver that can be loaded to read memory via that process that is signed. So there are ways around it, but it actually makes it a lot more difficult. And the thing I like about LSA protected process is it actually logs event IDs for any time a process is attempting to read LSA. So it's another great detection mechanism. All right. Probably the most important slide I think we have is privileged account management. Kind of three goals here. Identify your protected account, your privileged accounts, restrict the scope of privileged accounts that you have in your environment, and monitor them. Really the goal here, and I stole this one graphic from Microsoft, is restrict the exposure of privileged accounts on endpoints. So anything you use for tier 0, which are like your domain controllers, your very highly privileged sensitive type systems, those creds should not even be accessible to be used on tier 1, tier 2 systems. How do you do that? Group policy. So it's hard to see, I know, but that second diagram is an example of a GPO that essentially does this for you. So it's setting these specific settings and understanding the scope of tiered accounts you want to have in your environment and using group policy to kind of create this framework for you. There's other, obviously using protected users group is another great feature for privileged accounts. Another one I just want to highlight here is restricted admin RDP. What that does is if you use remote desktop to connect to systems, it doesn't expose the credentials or the hash of the user account in memory. Rather, it exposes the credentials of the computer account in memory. That's probably a little bit harder for an attacker to leverage the computer account. Hopefully it's not highly trusted or it's not like a domain admin level. I mean, I've never really seen that. So once again, it's just another way to kind of restrict the exposure of privileged accounts, especially if remote desktop is used by admins in your environment. This is a quick slide about, we sometimes, we'll talk about from the executive level, all these hardening guidelines, and they ask, well, why is this important? Why should I care? Well, these are various ways that credentials remain in memory on an endpoint after logon that can be used by an attacker to extract those passwords. So that's it. That's the in-memory portion. Also on disk, if you're using cached credentials, there's ways to extract those. There's also LSA secrets, which are used by service accounts. Those are also stored in the registry and can be accessed by an attacker. But these are various ways that credentials do remain in memory on endpoints based upon how you interact with the endpoint. The cloud, understand your cloud environment. There's different ways to integrate with the cloud. I think the important one is if you create accounts in Microsoft Office 365, all accounts have remote PowerShell access by default. Granted, it's role-based access to their own account, but once again, if you don't have MFA in place, or if you only have it on Outlook Web Access, but if you haven't explicitly disabled remote PowerShell, for those accounts, an attacker could still leverage that to get into the mailbox. So definitely either remove that privilege or enforce MFA there. And the Azure AD SSO ACC account, you need to change that decryption key every 30 days. This is an account that's created on all Prem AD environments by default. The key does not change unless you manually go change it yourself. So that's something you definitely want to do. You have to have repeated processes for this to work. This is not just simply do it once and never look at it again. Just like the Washington Capitals did last night when they beat the Boston Bruins 7-0, right? They had a playbook, they had a guide, they knew what they were doing. They tested, they practiced, right? They were good to go. We just don't want you to do this and now you have an event, you have an incident. You've never actually exercised this before because you're not probably going to do very well. So this is something, once you've kind of gone through these premediation steps, exercise this process, test it, identify your gaps, be honest, as Manfred said, be open about where your gaps are. It's not an audit, this is the time to do it and overcome those. This is bringing everything together. I think we're about over. At the top, in the middle, where we have the boxes were the stages of premediation that we discussed here. And we have the bullets there kind of in the middle in the light gray, are all the steps, if you did all those, that would have mitigated what that attacker did from that first case study that we talked about earlier in the presentation. At the top in red are the actual steps that that client ended up taking to help with that full remediation that worked to kick the attacker out, that everything pushed down to the endpoint, as mentioned previously. And in green, we have the different stages of the attack lifecycle that each of those premediation actions that we discussed help to protect against.
Yeah. What you can recommend to is that use premediation. It's a continuous process. Integrate this in your methodology, in your risk assessment in your environment. Test and verify the efficiency of the countermeasures, and adapt and enhance this process permanently. So this is the thing. It's not like with standard with remediation, where it's a sprint, where you have a breach, you have a lot of pressure. Implement remediation as a continuous process in your environment. This will not prevent you that you not get breached, but this will lower the impact massively within your environment. That's the reason we highly can recommend you on that.